as you go on with your things and expectations, sometimes our expectations can get rigid. It's not a mistake, but it happens all of a gradually, and we may not be aware of this process. In order to deal with this kind of a thinking pattern, we have today the right webinar for you all. And this is, they will give you tools, and they will give you some kind of tips how to come over it. And today we have a wonderful session which is being led by our colleagues from Alternative Story, Prarthana and Aburba. We know them beforehand. Yeah, they have already have taken sessions for us. And I cordially welcome both of you to this webinar on behalf of CHILDLINE India Foundation. Secondly, we have Mr. Andrew Zakaria from South as a senior program coordinator of Tamil Nadu, who is going to give the contest setting. And we have at the end, we have Jennifer Balan, who is going to give the concluding remarks as well as vote of thanks. I welcome both of you to this webinar. And especially, I would like to welcome all of you, all the participants from CAF as well as partner organizations. We know that directors, coordinators, counselors, team members, and even volunteers have joined in our Zoom as well as in a YouTube link. I think it's going to be a great learning experience for all of us. This to our webinar is going to be a wonderful session. I think it's very relevant topic because we, as we know that we have many expectations to be met, from various people. So sometimes our expectation can go, what we expect others to do and what we expect from us can go too rigid. It may not be that flexible, which can lead to some kind of a trauma or psychological trauma if we cannot meet those expectations. So there needs to be some kind of an adapting skill for each one of us to deal with the problem. So this webinar definitely going to be a self-learning one for all of us. Please do give your careful attention to this webinar. On behalf of CHILDLINE India Foundation, I heartily welcome everyone to this webinar. I think people are on the way to join, and some are already have joined. I think we may get a good kind of a participation today also, as we did in the earlier webinars. Now, I would like to welcome Mr. Andrew Zakaria to this webinar to set the contest. Andrew,
Thank you, Narish sir, and good morning to everyone. I think Narish sir also shed light on what I'm supposed to say. And alternative story is not new to us. We've been working with them, and now even when Narish sir introduced, he just mentioned them as they've been part of a team, and I'm really thankful to them for coming up with such interesting topics which are very relevant, which addresses contemporary issues. So to shed light on rigid expectations, there is often said, expectation is sometimes good, expectation is bad, expectations will determine how relationships are, expectations will really have a toll on your emotions and every kind of a thing. And especially this rigid expectation is very much relevant to CHILDLINE, I feel, because unlike other organizations, as CHILDLINEers, we work with different organizations, we work with different stakeholders, we work with the certain times, we have to work with the perpetrator, we have to work with a service seeker, and we also have to work with other CHILDLINEers. So amongst a set of different kind of people, there are certain expectations from ourselves, expectations from the counterpart, which could be based on perception, which could be based on reality. But how can we manage this? Often, for instance, I might have an expectation from my colleague, and when the expectation is not being fulfilled, there is a disappointment. How do we maneuver? So I feel that as a CHILDLINEer, we need to have hands-on tools. How can we counter this on everyday work on how to manage expectation and not to put ourselves into trouble, having too much of expectations and extreme, putting ourselves into a situation where we are stressed, and we go beyond a level of stress, we go into depression, where certain times expectation can cause. So now I would request the team from Alternative Story to shed light on what rigid expectations are. Is expectations good or is it bad? Where do we draw the line? And how can we work on ourselves, and how can we work with our colleagues and all these team members, so that we set certain expectations which is conducive, which is healthy, which promotes cohesiveness within organization. So once again, I would welcome Alternative Story, and it is also good to know that Childline has partnered with HCL to come up with these contemporary webinars where we address day-to-day issues. So over to the team, and as Childliners who have just tuned live here, and some people are watching in YouTube, we are looking forward to hear from you, like previous sessions, hands-on tools which could help us, and also to support our everyday work. So over to the team, and we are keenly looking forward something innovative and something new. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, both Pratik and you. We're also, I think, similarly excited to do this webinar with you because of the fact that we're also hoping that it would be useful for you all to understand how to identify these expectations. How do we understand whether this is a good expectation or an okay expectation to have, and how do you deal with them? I think that's something that we also similarly thought would be definitely important. So I think we'll start with that then. My colleague Apurva is going to start with the presentation, and Nandita is going to present it. So Nandita, if you can just sort of present the PPT.
Just give me a second.
Sure.
Can you see it?
Not yet. Yeah, now we can.
Yeah.
Just hold on.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you again,
Do you
everybody,
want
for
this part? I think it's going to obstruct the text. So I'm going to take it down.
yeah.
Wait, can you see your faces on the PPT?
Yes. No, not
Okay.
really.
No? Okay. Huh.
It's okay.
You guys can start.
All right. Thank you, everyone, again for such a warm welcome. It's great to be here again. And like Pratna said, I think we're all very excited to be here with the topic today, which is addressing rigid expectations. Before we start, feel free to just drop any questions or any thoughts you may have by either unmuting yourself or saying directly, or just leaving a chat here. We'll be taking a look at that. So the topic, like already we've shared here, addressing rigid expectations. I think before we get into even what are rigid expectations, let's just look at what are expectations in itself. Nandita, can we go to the next slide? So expectations, like you may all have definitely had a common understanding about it, but just to put it in a definition, I think these are something like beliefs that something is going to happen, or that something should be a certain way. Either it could be an expectation that you have, or other people that you're in relationship to, they may have. But these are just what we are made of. Expectations. To expect something is to know that something is going to happen. So I think the word expectation and beliefs are used interchangeably, but I'm just going to stick to expectation for the rest of the presentation. Now, what are the some of examples of expectations? I think, just to make the context a bit more clear, could be something as simple as, I hope this webinar is going to be helpful. This is an expectation. And an expectation for me is that I hope that I make sense for the rest of the presentation. That can be an expectation for myself. Or something like, I should be able to be respond to the questions that participants today may have. That can be another expectation. Or I should be able to take some of the learnings from this presentation. That can be another expectation, right? So you may already see that they almost sound like some of the wants or beliefs that you may have, which are so natural to us humans, I think. Now, the next point is what is now the purpose of expectations, right? Why are we talking about it? I think for this, I would like to encourage you all to think of this example that I want to share with all of you. Imagine that you are sitting on a roller coaster ride, right? Or a giant wheel, the one of the circle thingies that you'll go round and round in these fairs or exhibitions that we may all have enjoyed in our childhood. So imagine that you're being seated on that, and in first situation, you don't know what is this giant wheel or this roller coaster ride, first of all. So you don't know what is going to happen, right? You don't know that it is something that you do for fun. You have absolutely no expectations from this, and you have absolutely no idea about what is going to happen. And then imagine that the ride is going to start, and you are going through the ride, and the speed picks up. I There's a slight disturbance. I hope you all keep yourself muted because I don't know if I'm being audible. So the ride is starting, the speed is picking up, and you don't know what is happening. Can you just imagine the kind of experiences you may have in that moment? I think for me, if I imagine myself in that situation, it's just a lot of panic. It's just a lot of confusion, fear, and a very general feeling of unsafety, right? Because what is this crazy thing that's going on? I may fall sometime or I may hurt myself anytime, right? This is situation one. And another situation is that you're on the same roller coaster ride or the giant wheel you're imagining, but this time you know that this is a roller coaster ride. When a person is going to hit the start button, you're going to be in ride, and it's going to be absolutely scary, but it is going to be so much fun. By the end of it, I am going to be so excited and happy, and that, you know, even if I panic, maybe if I hold up a red cloth or something, they may stop, and so in that way my safety will be ensured. You know, if you have all of these ideas, if you have all of these expectations, in other words, can you imagine how that ride is going to be like for you? Right? It's so much different, the two situations. Even if the situation is the same, that you're just on a ride that's going to take you on this roller coaster, but just the fact that you have expectations about the ride and you don't have expectations about the ride is going to make the experience so much more different for you. And so that's what expectations do for us. Like the first point that's written here, it makes life more predictable and thus less stressful. You know, it's going to make more predictable, just like in the example, you know what you can predict in a minute, the ride is going to start and it's going to be scary, but it's going to be fun. You know, you can predict what's going to happen. And it's a very natural thing for humans that when you know that you can predict something, there is automatically lesser stress, right? Because you know what's going to happen. When you don't know what's going to happen, then the situation is always scary. Another purpose of expectations, like I already mentioned in the example, is that it provides a sense of safety and a sense of control, like just a general sense that you are in control of things when you have certain expectations. Let's also think about this example that I gave, that, you know, the expectation that I should be helpful in this webinar today. This gives me a sense of control, because then I know that if I'm able to deliver my points well, maybe I'm going to be helpful, right? It's not like I'm not in control at all. The very fact that I have certain expectations is going to make me feel little safe, little predictable about the webinar, and a little bit in control. And I think another point that comes to my mind here is that it makes you learn about something and thus prepares you for a future instance. Like, the example that comes to my mind is that let's take an example of you talking to your friend and you say something really stupid in an attempt to make fun of your friend, but your friend is really upset because you made a comment on them and they're going to stop talking to you. So you learned from this experience that you making a fun comment on them, which was insensitive maybe, has hurt the friend. So next time you're going to be careful about making such fun comments about them, which may be insensitive, right? So in a way, I think to have expectation is to know what will happen if I do certain thing, or what will happen if I think about something in a certain way. And also to not have expectations, I think is like a situation where a person with short-term memory loss may have, unfortunately, where, for every 15 or 20 minutes, you're going to forget whatever was going on with you and what were you supposed to do or how are you supposed to live. These basic things you may not be able to know for sure or predict for sure. So it just becomes more difficult. So yeah, expectations can be really important. And now, Navita, let's just go to the next slide, please. Now I just want to ponder over a little bit more about understanding expectations, because now we know that these are our expectations. These are expectations that we may have, and these are the purpose. But why are we really talking about it in today's webinar? Is because they not just provide a sense of safety or control or make our lives a little bit more predictable, but they also have an effect on our understanding of reality and in determining our reality as well. Now, what I mean by that is, let's go back to our childhood days, maybe back when in our school, right? If you all remember about any class, when you were in any grade, when an exam is going to occur, if you all just think about how you felt as a child, as a student, if you were one of those kids who were quite confident about yourself and you had an expectation that I know that I'm going to do well, right? The exam is going to be actually better. You are actually going to perform better. But if you were one of those kids who were quite unsure, and I'm guessing most of us, me included, who were quite unsure and who were probably really anxious, or even may to the extreme have thoughts like, I know that I'm really going to fail this paper, then there are high chances that you're going to find the paper really difficult. In that way, I think having certain expectations determine what our reality is going to be like. In this context, I want to bring about a study here. I don't want to get into too much of it, but I think it's a really interesting study since we are talking about this. It was a 1960s Harvard study, which the gist of it was that certain teachers were told that certain group of students are going to be exceptionally well academically, and a certain other group of students are not that exceptionally well. They were just told this, not because it was actually true. This was just one of the things that researchers sometimes do to alter some of the implications of the study. But so it was not the fact, but they just told the teachers that this group A is really good, group B is not. So the teachers knew that fact. And by the end of the term, when the students were given some tests, and especially IQ tests, the results were such that the group A actually had increased their IQ score than group B, even if it was not true that they were exceptionally well, just because the teachers had an expectation that, okay, these students are exceptionally well. Just this expectation influenced how they're going to behave with their students, how they probably treated their students. Maybe they treated them with more respect, or maybe they pushed them more to do well. Maybe they sort of just, in the non-verbals that we may have, indicated that you're really going to do well in this. And that actually came quite true. The IQ scores, like I said, were actually quite significantly increased than the IQ scores before. So now what does this mean for us, right? It's a huge understanding for us that having certain expectations means that, it's going to determine some of the things for us. For example, how I'm going to be um, with a certain thing. Like, for example, in your own line of work, I think having an expectation that I'm a good worker and I do fairly well in my job is actually going to affect your confidence levels, and maybe it shows in the performance that you do. But if you're seriously struggling with your uh, beliefs about yourself, then it may show in the performance as to you may be unsure or less confident about what you do, and it comes across to the people, right? Another thing that I think is important here is this also means that we learn what behaviors are accepted and what behaviors are not accepted through having certain expectations and doing certain things. Like, let's say if you're able to do really well in your work, then your employer and your colleagues are really going to appreciate you and provide bonus maybe. So then you will have an expectation that, okay, if I do well, this behavior is going to be accepted, and so I can repeat doing this in the future. In the opposite end, if I do something not so great, like let's say if I show up to work very lately every single day, and then one day my employer tells me that, hey, you know what, this is not accepted. I think we may have to cut your salary a little bit or something like that. An outcome that you don't like, you will have then an understanding, and that's an expectation that I have to be early to work. If not, so and so is going to happen. So it like I said, it thus has an effect on our general understanding and determination of our reality. And the other thing that's written here is expectations not only impact us, like said in the first point, but also our feelings, behavior, and therefore our relationships. Now, this is a really interesting thing. I think this is one of the most important things that we look for in our relationships too. And one of the member already said, how do we know where to draw a line between healthy expectations and unhealthy expectations, right? And here I think it's important to consider the fact that people get what they expect. I may be too quick and too jumpy to have made that statement, but many studies show that people, if I live my life expecting that I should get treated well, then I may actually get treated well. Or even in the case that if I'm going to get treated badly, I can at least stand up to myself and say that no, this is not done. I'm not going to take this bad behavior because I know that I deserve to be treated well, right? And I'm saying this as an example because there was another study which was conducted for about 10 years, I think, on married couples, and the results came out to be this observation that people with low expectations, for example, thinking that I should not be maybe I won't be treated well. This is an expectation, right? Maybe I won't be treated well in relationships, or an expectation that I may not be happy the most of my life. Such people, or people with such low expectations, tended to be in relationships where their partners were really somebody who would actually hurt them or let them down, and they would just settle in that relationship because that's what they expected. On the other end, people with high expectations, healthy expectations that I deserve to be happy, I deserve to be treated well. People with such expectations did not settle for abusive partners or partners who did not even care so much, and in fact chose to stay in relationships where partners respected them, where partners cared for them. So I think this is really important for us to consider, because like I said, we get what we expect, in a sense that what we think about ourselves, what we believe about ourselves, is something we all should really take some time and think about. What are my own beliefs about myself? um, how healthy are they? How unhealthy are they? And one more thing that comes into picture while talking about this is that, when thinking about parenting, it may just be enough that to ensure that your daughter, for example, is safe in her future. Just one of the things that you could do probably today is to just make sure that you treat her with respect, so that she builds on this expectation that I deserve to be treated with respect. And so in future this expectation is carried, and god forbid if she is to meet somebody who is not going to let that happen, she can at least stand up for herself, if that's possible, and think for herself that I don't need to stay in this relationship, even for a son. Maybe I'm just giving an example, right? And I think this is not only helpful to consider about parenting, but also for teachers, while having a certain kind of relationship with students. At least I am having memories of some of my own teachers in school who were quite discouraging, and who would say to some of the students on face that, oh, you're such a failure, oh, this is not done, oh, you're going to be worthless in your future. And these are not just something that teachers throw because of their irritation. We should understand that they carry a certain weightage for the student to receive that, because all of this is going to impact what a child thinks about himself or herself, and that will then impact their own understanding of themselves and their own understanding of their reality. So I think these are certain nuances that we may have to think about when we are talking about expectations. I think even in terms of your relationships in your work, you may consider what are some of the expectations that I have from my colleagues. Do I have any expectations? Can I have expectations? I think that's another question. Some people may find it difficult to have expectations, I think, which can be another whole discussion in itself. But if you have certain expectations, are they realistic enough or not? I think we'll talk about this in more detail in a bit. Pratna will be talking about that. But yeah, I think some of the questions that we may consider about at this point, when we are talking about expectations in relationships, are that if I do have certain expectations, where did I get these expectations from? Where did I learn them from? Did I learn it from my parents? Did I learn it from my school? Did I learn this kind of thinking from my society or from my culture? Things like that. And then the last point here is we can have different types of expectations. I think this is already brought up. I can have expectations from myself. I can have expectations from others. Like I said, others should treat me fairly. My boss should treat me fairly. My children should respect me. My parents should love me. I think there is no limit to the kind of expectations us humans can have. And lastly, expectations from the world. I think this comes so strongly to me because there are so many expectations we have from the world right now. I think in terms of our political inclinations, that a certain government should do this, or a certain government is doing that and it's good or it's not good, whatever the case may be. Or the fact with COVID, in fact, that if one of your beliefs, one of your expectation is something that life should be fair, which translate to everything should be fair and easy in life. Times like today, that in pandemic can be so difficult because one of your expectation is shattered, right? This just does not sit with you, that today we are living through a global pandemic, because it's so not in your expectation. And if one of your expectations is that I should be safe all the time, or people I love should be safe all the time. I think times like this of today can be extremely scary for us, like most of us are already experiencing amidst the pandemic. So then what do we do if these are our expectations, and if we are living in times like today, then what do we do? And again, we are coming to that in a little bit. One other last point that I want to make here is, I think about culture and gender. I think why I'm bringing up the point that how you treat others really adds to what expectations they have themselves. Is if you can think about women in some of our cultured societies, in some of our societies, really count on the fact, not really count, but they just look at the fact how they're treated, and that affects their reality in the future. If you may know of, in certain, I think in your field work too, you would have seen of various cultures where women will not probably be allowed to work. I won't even say encouraged. Some women in some culture are not allowed to work outside, and the expectations from women then in that case are something like, you are just supposed to, I don't know, marry and bear kids, and then that's it. If that is so, for the women herself, her level of self-esteem or her purpose of life becomes so limited, right? So I think thinking about gender and culture and also becomes very important when you're talking about what kind of culture we live in and how this affects our expectations. Can we go to the next slide, Malita? I hope I'm not going too fast. Just let me know in the chat if I am. I think I already touched upon this, but we have a specific example for you all to consider here. We are just adding a variable of pandemic to the discussion of expectations now, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. How do we think of expectations in a time when we are not living in a global pandemic versus when we are living in a global pandemic, right? The example that's written here, you can consider as situation one, where a friend calls you over for a party or for a function or a wedding, whatever it is. Imagine just that as a situation where you're called or invited over for a party by your friend. Can you think about some of the expectations that you may have from this? From expectations from yourself, expectations from all the other people that may be in the party, expectations from the host, your friend in themselves. I think some of the expectations that come to my mind are I should be friendly with everybody, or the host should treat me well, I should have fun, things like that. But now, if you consider the same situation in times of a pandemic, can you think of if your expectations change? If they have changed, are they more complex now or less complex? And if they are more complex, what kind of expectations they are? I think some of the things that come to my mind are, and here is the thing, right? It's not like some of your earlier expectations are gone. The expectations that you anyway have from a situation where a friend calls you up for a party, like you should be fun, you should have fun, everybody should be nice to you, and all of that are still there. But upon that, there are a new set of expectations, very emotionally toned expectations, by which I mean that stronger expectations, because there is a sense of fear. Expectations like, I hope everybody should be wearing a mask. I hope everybody is maintaining social distance. I hope not more than 20 people come for the party. I hope I don't get infected by any of the person. I hope nobody coughs. So, whatever the expectation can be, you can see how much different and how much more complex our general expectations can be in times of pandemic. Not just about friend calling you over for a party. This was just an example for you all to think about on these lines. But take about any situation in general. You can think of how times like this today, one of pandemic, can make our expectations so much more layered, as in there are so many things to consider, so many adjustments to make. And what does this do in general? What does this do in the end is that it just adds to a sense of pressure and discomfort and lot of anxiety. Can we go to the next slide? I think we have one more slide before this, Nandita. The one on why are we talking about? Yeah, this. Thank you. This is just one last thing that I want to touch upon here. Is the very fact, is the very question that, okay, that's all fine, but why are we talking about expectations really? Like in a psychological context today, why are we talking about this? Is the dialogue box that you see here with A, B, C as labels. This is one of the theories from psychology, which is called the rational emotive behavioral therapy, which I'll not go deep into, but to give you all the gist of it here is the thing that the emotions that we feel from any particular situation are not mainly because of a particular event or a particular situation, but because of the beliefs that we have about that particular situation or about ourselves or about the world in general. So emotions that we feel are not directly because of a situation, but because of the beliefs we hold about that situation. I think this is extremely important to understand this, because again, coming back to the COVID example, if I'm feeling anxiety today, it is not just because there is COVID, which is the situation, but it is because of my belief that I should be healthy, I should be safe. If that is my belief, then a situation like pandemic or just a very risky environment outside can be anxiety causing. So any other situation you may consider, an event like a breakup, let's say in a relationship. If the event is breakup of a relationship, loss of a relationship, and the emotion we feel is disappointment or sadness or whatever, the event in itself, the breakup in itself did not cause the emotion of sadness, but your belief that, I want this relationship to be life sustaining. I want this relationship to be healthy and strong, and both of us should be together all the time. Beliefs like this can make the event much more complex and much more difficult. So what does this mean for us when we are thinking about a problem and a possible solution for this? Is that when in times of crisis, when in times of a problem, the solution to fix it is not to change a particular problem or a particular event, but to think about how can I change my expectations about it. That's what is written here. So the key to fix something when it isn't working for us is to alter or change our expectations instead of trying to change the situation. Now it is so hopeful if you think about it, because an event like a pandemic is not something that I can do something about, right? I cannot just raise my magic wand and say disappear COVID. It's not in my control. So many things are not in our control if you think about it. So then what do I do? If I change my expectation from something like I should always be safe and healthy, if I can change it to something like I hope I'm able to take care of myself, I hope I'm able to save most of the time, if I change it to a healthier, much healthier and a much realistic expectation, then my anxiety is going to be so much more less and manageable. So that is the homecoming point here. When you have a problem, instead of trying to fix the problem, can we change our expectations in itself? So that was the main point of the theory and the slide here. I saw that one of the participants raised a hand here. Do you have any questions, any thoughts you would like to share with us? If you have any questions, you can write here at this point, or we can just take questions at the end, whichever is all right. If not, Pratna will be continuing with the rest of the presentation. Okay, I think Pratna, you can go ahead and we'll just see if questions come up at any point later.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there are any questions
Yeah.
on. Sorry, I think someone's trying to speak. No. If if you're having trouble in connection issues or asking the question on by unmuting yourself, please feel free to also drop in a question so that we know that that's the question. We'll try to address it. All right. Okay. So then I think we'll move ahead. Now that Apurva has talked to you guys about what are expectations, what can expectations look like, and why are we really talking about expectations at all? Why is this even important to talk about? So that you have some rationale or some understanding of what importance expectations can have in terms of how much control we have over our expectations. Because I think a lot of the times when we have expectations from certain situations, we're also taught that we don't have too much control over our expectations, that once you have an expectation, there's nothing you can do about it. And but in order to understand how to change our expectations, one of the first most important steps in that process becomes trying and understand, even identifying what is the kind of expectation that you're having. Because it's not like all expectations are bad and that you should never have any expectations from any situation, or that all expectations are good and we must live a life in which all of our expectations are going to be fulfilled and that's the only way to live. I think either of those extremes are not going to be very useful for any of us. So to a certain extent, one of the most important steps in dealing with expectations becomes identifying what kind of expectation we're having in any particular situation. So right now, what we're going to spend some time in talking about is to talk about what are the different kind of expectations that can exist in our own minds for a particular situation, right? And considering the situation that we brought up in the beginning, where if someone calls you, if your friend calls you to their house, if your friend calls you to their party, then what kind of expectations what expectations are you having, and what kind of expectations are those, right? So the first kind of expectation that we're going to talk about are flexible expectations. Flexible expectations are basically where you have some expectations, but you're not attaching too much of your own self or too much feeling to those expectations. Is that you have the expectation, but even if it's not fulfilled, you're not necessarily going to be too distressed about it. It's there, but it's also just you feel ambivalent about it. If it happens, it happens. It doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. That's okay. So to a certain extent, flexible expectations means that you do have expectations from your environment, you do have expectations from yourself, or you do have expectations from other people. But if those expectations are not necessarily met, or if those expectations aren't fulfilled the way that you thought they were, it doesn't necessarily, you're able to adjust or adapt to it. So those are flexible. You're flexible to the expectation. You're also flexible to changing your expectation according to the situation around you. So the example that's given here is, I want to help as many people as I could, but it's okay if for some reason I am unable to. Right. So to a certain extent, In this particular example, the person does have an expectation from themselves to be able to help as many people as possible. But at the same time, it's also possible to say that even if the person is not able to meet that expectation, which is that they should help people, even if they're not able to help people, that it's okay for whatever reason. So they're also able to understand that if a particular expectation is not met, what could be the reason, or what could be the idea behind that expectation not being met, which usually becomes a very important aspect of our everyday life, is that we do have expectations, but how do we deal with the process of them not being met or them being met? How do we think of those expectations after the situation that we're preparing for actually turns out that way? So those are flexible expectations. Weak expectations is another kind of expectation that you can have, which is a situation in which you don't have particularly strong expectations, or you don't have any expectations from that particular situation. And that can happen from ourselves, that can happen from in terms of our work, sometimes that can happen in terms of us with our family. Sometimes that can happen with the pandemic as well, is that you don't necessarily have expectations. In this particular situation that we're all stuck in, I think, try to think of like how we used to have expectations from perhaps the COVID-19 finding a vaccine, or it going away, or the lockdown helping us. In the beginning, in March, you may have had different expectations from the pandemic. You may have had different expectations from Corona itself. And now versus now, how are your expectations towards the pandemic? How are your expectations towards that? It's also possible that you might not have expectations, because this has gone on a lot longer than anyone has anticipated. This has become a lot more complicated for all of us, and we're all finding our ways of dealing with it. But to a certain extent, that also means that it's possible for you to have weak expectations from it, because of the fact that there's so much uncertainty, because of the fact that there's so much about it that's difficult, that you may have weak expectations from it, to say, I don't really expect anything to happen anymore, I don't expect anything to change. So that's one of the examples for having weak expectations, is to not really have much of an expectation from a particular situation or another person. So the example that's given here for a weak expectation is that I don't expect anybody to understand me. And sometimes you can have these weak expectations about other people, in terms of saying that if it's something that you haven't experienced, then it can be difficult for you to have that expectation if you don't know that's even a possibility, right? Sometimes if we're, for example, living in a very conservative family, sometimes we can have expectations, we can have a lack of expectations from them, to necessarily to like be okay with trying new things, being okay with doing something else. We can also have weak expectations from children, because we think they're children, and we don't necessarily think that they can think or do too much. So sometimes we don't have too many, we have very weak expectations from people who are younger than us, sometimes. So those are all examples of having weak or very few expectations from a particular situation. Does this make sense? Does anyone have any questions so far? Please feel free to unmute yourself or let us know in the chat, and we'll try to answer them before we move forward.
അധികം വന്നിട്ടുണ്ടെന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു കേട്ടോ. എങ്ങനെ നടക്കുക? 2 രൂപ കൂട്ടി തന്നാണ്ട് വ്യത്യാസം വന്നാ 870 എന്റെ ഓർമ്മയിൽ. 8 രൂപ കൽക്കുലേഷൻ വന്നപ്പോ എങ്ങനെ വന്നിട്ടുണ്ട്? 878 പിന്നെ 10 നമുക്ക് തരാം.
Okay, I think then we can move forward. Please let us know if you have any questions. All right. So now I think we're going to come to the main aspect of why we are even having this webinar, or what is the reason that we're trying to sort of include all of these aspects of what expectations can look like, what are the type of expectations, is to understand what are rigid expectations. The reason that we need to talk about rigid expectations over other kinds of expectations is the fact that when we have flexible or weak expectations, that to a certain extent kind of means that we are able to change according to the situation. We expect something and it doesn't happen, then we're able to adapt to that particular situation. We're able to then understand what to do in that particular context or with ourselves. But when it becomes difficult, or when it becomes difficult for us to deal with other people, or when there is conflict, according to this school of thought, is when we have rigid expectations. Rigid expectations are usually when we expect something to happen for, without necessarily too much of a rationale or too much of a logic to it, when we necessarily expect a very specific expectation from a situation, and if that situation does not turn out the way that we thought it would, or if that expectation is not fulfilled, then we feel distress, or we feel it has an effect on us for sure. And the reason that we need to deal with this particular situation is because, like Apurva mentioned, expectations have an effect on us and determine our reality. They affect our feelings, they affect our thoughts, and they affect our behavior. And usually that becomes a cause for concern or a problem when the expectations are too rigid. So that's kind of why we wanted to talk about expectations that are rigid. So the main characteristics of rigid expectations are that they take you away from your goals. In the sense that, say, for example, if you need to get a particular task done at work, and if you are given that task to be finished by a particular deadline, um, and if that deadline is not, sometimes we can feel a lot of stress or a lot of anxiety about that particular deadline, and because we are so worried about that deadline and we're spending so much time worrying about the deadline, we can then not feel like working. That tension reaches a level where we're not even working. We know we're supposed to work, but we're not doing it. So to a certain extent, the rigid expectation can come into play here to say that you're supposed to do the work perfectly, or you have an expectation that the work is supposed to be done a particular way and you're not going to do it any other way. So to a certain extent, a rigid expectation from your deadline can mean that it's taking you away from the goal, which is to finish the work by the deadline. So that is one of the characteristics of a rigid expectation. Another characteristic of rigid expectations can be that there is black and white thinking. What we mean by black and white thinking is that we can either think that situations are either very, very good and they are perfect and they are amazing, and it's brilliant, or we can think that it's completely black, which means that if something didn't happen, if a situation didn't turn out the way that we thought it would, or if your expectations are not fulfilled, it means that it's completely terrible. It's all bad, everything is horrible, everything is going to fall apart. And to a certain extent, we can having rigid expectations from a particular situation can mean that we either expect everything to be like amazing or everything to be terrible, and that there is no middle ground, there is no space for any other kind of situation to occur. So, for example, say in the example of the expectations that we did in the beginning, where you said that, say, for example, you have to go to a party and you have expectations from yourself that you will have fun at this party. You have expectations from the host that they will that they will pay attention to you and that they will talk to you and it will be a lot of fun together, right? And you can have expectations from the other people or from the situation of the party that it's going to be safe and that it's going to be okay, and that it's going to be a good place for you to be in. And if any of these expectations are not met, if even two of these expectations are met but one of these expectations are not met, and you feel upset about that, Black and white thinking means that because that one expectation is not met, you start to feel like everything is bad, that the party was horrible, that it was just a really, really bad party and nothing was good about it, even though only one of your expectations was met and actually the other two expectations were. Um, or that if everything went well, then everything needs to be perfect. So it having rigid expectations from any situation can mean that you put these expectations in these particular boxes about whether something is amazing or whether something is absolutely terrible, and there is no in between for that. Another characteristic of rigid expectations is that sometimes what we can do is, in order to meet the expectations or in order to make sure that those expectations are fulfilled, we sometimes try to fight for it. We sometimes say, no, it has to happen this way and no other way. uh, People can get stubborn about the way that their expectations need to be met. Say for example, if you with your children, like sometimes parents are very strict about how they want their children to study or how they want their children to perform in school, and that is in itself an okay expectation to have, but what kind of expectation is it influences their behavior towards their children, right? So if you had a rigid expectation about your child's performance in school or about the marks that your children get, it means that you can sometimes get angry with them or sometimes feel like you need to be strict with them in order to meet the rigid expectation that you have from their performance in school, saying you need to get good marks, you need to get 90%, you need to get first rank. These kind of expectations, we can sometimes use conflict or sometimes use force to be able to get that expectation. So when we start doing that, when we start increasing conflict, because once we start you being strict, even if it doesn't get that expectation, even if it doesn't get marks, sometimes parents can get frustrated saying, I keep telling him to study, I keep telling my child to study properly, I keep running behind him to do his homework, but he still doesn't get good marks. That can sometimes mean that despite the fact that that particular way of behaving is not getting you the result you want, still you are maintaining that expectation. We're not questioning that belief or that expectation at all, despite increasing the conflict to get there. So that's another characteristic of a rigid expectation. Another thing that is a characteristic of a rigid expectation is a refusal to accept limitations, a refusal to accept the fact that there are some things that we might not be able to do. So say for example, like in this situation with parents and children, we might have an expectation of them to get first rank in school, and if they don't get first rank in school, we will not, if we're finding it difficult to accept the fact that the teachers might not be that good, or this is a subject that the child isn't very strong in, or it's just a difficult time in a pandemic right now for children to be able to study. These are limitations that children will face in studies, in concentration, in focus, in understanding, because they're not in a classroom environment, right? But to a certain extent, these limitations can be very difficult to accept, and if they become difficult to accept, then that means that it is a rigid expectation. So that is one more characteristic of a rigid expectation. Another characteristic of rigid expectation means that it would be you have an excessive need to establish control over the particular situation. So in the same example that I gave with children and their marks, if you feel like a particular your child needs to get good marks and that's not happening, but if you feel the need to meet these expectations, if you feel the need to constantly do something to meet the expectations, it means that you're trying to establish control over the situation by saying, no, it has to happen this way, it has to happen the way that I am thinking about it, it has to happen the way I expect it to happen, no other way is possible. That's when we're also trying to use our behavior to try to establish control over the situation. And the reason that this sometimes becomes a problem when we're trying to establish control over the situation is when we might not actually have that much control, or uh, we're not accepting the limitations over that particular situation. So that is also a characteristic of rigid expectations. So to a certain extent, it's also important to know that these characteristics and of rigid expectations are not separate from each other. They are not happening separately, but sometimes they also happen together. So sometimes what can happen is you can have a lot. You can have black or white thinking, and then you can refuse to accept the limitations of a particular situation, which might take you away from your goals. Or you might have increasing conflict with your coworkers or your children or your family members to meet certain expectations. You might do something to try and establish control over that situation, and that might then lead to more conflict. So that these kind of rigid expectations don't necessarily happen separately. Sometimes they happen, you have many characteristics of them kind of working together to make things difficult for everyone around us. And it's important for us. That's why when trying to understand how to deal with expectations, or how to understand how to sort of have more of an idea of how to be more at peace with our expectations, is to move away from having rigid expectations. And the way in which we have to deal with moving away from rigid expectations is, first of all, to actually identify or accept the fact that your expectations are rigid, which in itself can be the most difficult part of it. The most difficult part is literally trying to understand which of my expectations are rigid, and what are the expectations I'm having from a particular situation. And that requires some kind of reflection, some kind of thinking, some kind of introspection to go within ourselves to try and understand that if we're feeling distressed, if we're feeling upset, if you're feeling irritated or angry towards a particular situation, towards a particular person, or even at ourselves. Like sometimes we can be quite upset with ourselves when we don't get something done, or when we don't do something. And in those situations, when we're very, very upset for a really long time, we feel disappointed, it is important to then take a look at what are these expectations that we may have had in this particular situation, from ourselves, from other people, or from the world, and were they rigid or flexible or weak. And that can help us in understanding why are we feeling upset, why are we feeling disappointed or angry. And that kind of understanding, that kind of self reflection can really help us in managing those expectations. If you take the step of trying to identify what kind of expectations you're having, that can be usually like 50% of the work is almost done in terms of dealing with your expectations. Because the minute you have an understanding of what those expectations are, whether they were rigid or not, what did you want from this particular situation, that kind of helps and gives you more control and more agency to handle your own feelings, to be able to deal with the feelings that come up with it. So say for example, in the situation that I was talking about when talking about rigid expectations, if you have rigid expectations towards your children's performance in school, that can affect your mood, your behavior, your own thoughts about your child, and that can affect you. You might be upset and angry and really stressed about your child's performance in school. You could worry about it all the time. You could be really irritated at home, and that could affect how much time you spend with your child. That could affect other aspects of your life as well, in terms of your performance at work, or your work at home, or your behavior with other people in your life apart from your child. Because when we take stress about something, or when we feel upset about something, it doesn't just affect that particular situation, or doesn't just stay within that particular situation. It affects other aspects of your life. So if you're stressed about something at work, and because you have rigid expectations there, that stress then translates to other aspects of your life as well. You start feeling stressed at home, you start taking out that stress in other spaces. So that's why it becomes important to understand what are our expectations, and what kind of expectation was it. I hope I'm making sense here. Please feel free to ask any questions or share any thoughts that you might have about this right now. You can unmute yourself, or drop it in the chat, and we'd be happy to talk to you about it. Even if you have comments, that's also fine. No problem. We just want to make sure that you've understood what we're talking about, or we're not going too fast, for sure. All right. Okay. Then I think if there is no questions, we're going to do a small activity with you guys. If it's okay, you can put your responses on chat, or you can unmute yourself, or you can let us know. Is a small activity that I wanted to do with you all. I'm going to read out these statements and you can let me know what kind of expectation it is. And then we will let you know the answers to that after you tell us your responses. Is that okay? All right. So let's start with the first one. I am putting my life at risk by working in the field during a pandemic while taking all the precautions. People should be cooperative. What kind of expectation is this? Anyone? Does anyone have any answers? Would anyone like to try? What kind of expectation would this be? Is this a rigid expectation? Is this a weak expectation? Is this a flexible expectation? Once Jennifer says it's a flexible expectation, all right. Does anyone else have any answers? Sampath says flexible. Abhishek also says flexible. All right. Okay. Actually, interestingly, the first one is a rigid expectation. It's not uh, it's a rigid expectation in the sense that there is no statement about the fact that if people are not cooperative, what happens? Is this person okay with the fact that people aren't going to be cooperative if they walk down the street and there are people wearing no masks? It is a valid expectation to have, but it is a rigid expectation to say everyone should be cooperative. Yeah. So the first one is a rigid expectation actually. All right, let's try the second one. Others should be as hardworking and dedicated as I am towards work. What kind of expectation is this? Jennifer says rigid. Anyone else would like to try? Rigid. All right, I guess you're getting the hang of it now. Yes, it is a rigid expectation. All right, then let's go to the third one. My team leader is busy doing other things and unable to manage PPE kits and masks. It's okay. I will wear a dupatta napkin while working on the field. What kind of expectation is this? Someone says flexible. Someone says flexible again. Abhishek says weak. Suparna says flexible. Flexible. Suresh. Is anyone trying to speak? All right. Actually, this is a weak expectation because there is no expectation in this particular expectation, right? Team leaders are busy doing other things and unable to do something, but this person is saying that they will wear a dupatta and napkin. So to a certain extent, they're adjusting to it without having any expectation at all, or having very little expectation for the PPE kits to be delivered. So they are already deciding that they're going to wear a dupatta napkin while working on the field. So it's a weak expectation here. But I think there's one person that said weak, Abhishek. All right, so let's go to the next one. I hope we are able to meet all our goals, but it's okay if my team members are unable to meet some of them. What kind of expectation is this? Flexible, Suparna said. Flexible. Right, Ramesh also said flexible. Yes, you guys are right. This is a flexible expectation because there is an expectation about meeting goals, but it also said that it's okay if they're unable to meet some of them. So, to a certain extent, expectation is there, but saying that if the expectation is not, that's also fine. If some of the expectations is not met, that's also fine. And that's an important aspect of expectations that are flexible. Is that it's there, but if it doesn't happen, that's fine. We'll be able to adjust.
क्या इधर खींच छाव नका बोल मेरा बोल
All right, someone needs to mute. All right, let's do the last one. I hope to help as many
Prarthana,
people.
I need a clarity. Actually, I want a clarity. For
Yes.
question number 3,
Yeah.
it is like my team member, somewhat they are okay to wear dupatta or napkin instead of mask. So they are flexible enough if they wanted to work. If they say, I don't care about wearing mask, I don't care about dupatta, then that would become weak, right? Because they have some alternative solution to go about it. So I thought it is flexible. What do you like to say?
To a certain extent, definitely they're adapting to that particular situation, saying if it doesn't happen, but they've already accepted that it's not going to happen, right? They're saying the team leaders unable to do it. I don't expect anything to happen, so I will wear it. So definitely they're being adapting to the situation. They're changing because they're not able to get something, but they don't expect it to happen at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if you give me a clarity, I mean, any example for the weak expectation for the same sentence, it will make more clarity for me, I feel.
Right. So, if this particular person say right now, what this statement is a weak expectation, a flexible expectation in this particular situation would instead look like my team. I hope my team member is able to manage PPE kits and masks. If they are not able to manage it, I will wear a dupatta and napkin instead. Does that make sense? It's a very small distinction in this particular case, but it's basically not necessarily about what the person does as much as what the person expects. In a flexible expectation, they would expect it to happen. They would expect to get the PPE kits and masks anyways, but will be okay with an alternative if it doesn't happen. But a weak expectation is that they're already deciding it's not going to happen. They're already saying he's unable to manage it. And then saying that, okay, I will wear a dupatta and napkin instead. So the behavior is similar, but the expectation is already decided beforehand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
The expectation is different here. That's all. Thank you. Does anyone have any other question? All right, then let's do the last one. I hope to help as many people as possible in this pandemic. But just some days I can only help myself. Ramesh says flexible. Suparna says weak. Abhishek says weak. Someone says rigid. Okay. Jennifer says weak. this is actually a flexible expectation, right? Because this is an expectation that's set. I hope to help as many people as possible in this pandemic is an expectation, right? To say that I want to help as many people, but some days I can only help myself. And to say that the expectation might not be met means that it is flexible. So this expectation is actually flexible. So there seems to be a little bit of conflict between weak and flexible expectations. And some say statements feel like they're flexible because what we're doing is flexible, and some while they seem flexible may be weak. So what's really important to focus on when we're trying to identify the type of expectation is not to focus on what the person is doing, but to focus on what the person is expecting from that situation. Does that make sense? Is to then look at what did the person anticipate was going to happen. If the person anticipated that something was going to happen and is okay with whether it happens or not, that's a flexible expectation. If the person doesn't expect anything to happen and is already changing that particular situation, that means that it's a weak expectation, because it's either that they have a very little expectation from a situation or they have no expectation from it. They're saying that I will take care of myself. That's when it becomes a weak expectation. I hope that makes sense to everyone. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask about this? All right. Then I hope I hope that made sense to everyone. I think we can move forward if no one else has any questions. This is how we tend to identify our expectations from a particular situation. What I really also want to talk about before we move ahead is that having weak or flexible expectations is not a bad thing. It's not necessary that if you have weak expectations, it's not good for you to have weak expectations and that you should only have flexible expectations. But it's important to just try and understand what kind of expectations we're having and how okay are we with the fact that if it doesn't happen, are we still able to hold that expectation while knowing that there is a chance it might not happen. I hope that makes sense. You can move forward, Nanta, if no one has questions. All right. So, in this particular section, we'll try and then understand. Now that we understand what expectations are, now that we've tried and talked about what kind of expectations can exist, we've talked about how to identify these particular expectations within ourselves. We've talked about how situations can change our expectations, how we can have certain expectations from certain contexts, and how it can also influence how we're feeling, how we're behaving, how we're thinking. Then we can sort of move on to talking about how do we manage these expectations. Because like I said before, sometimes what happens is that when we have particular expectations from a particular situation, a lot of us are also taught to sort of never question those expectations, or we're never really opened. Nobody really teaches us about how to manage them, or even nobody even tells us that we have any control over these expectations. Nobody tells us that it's something that you can actually change about yourself, and that's something that what we wanted to spend some time in talking about. So before we do that, I kind of wanted to understand, now that you know this much about expectations and the kind of expectations that we've talked about for the last 1.5 hours, I wanted to sort of ask you guys, what do you think are the expectations that you have when working in your field? And is that something that you can identify as weak or flexible? So if anyone would like to share any thoughts that they have on this, please feel free to do it so by unmuting themselves or on the chat. What are the expectations that happens? It can be expectations from yourself. It can be expectations from your coworkers. It can be expectations from the field. It can be expectations from your team members, your bosses, your organization in general, your family members, the children. What kind of expectations do you think you have? Would anyone like to share?
I expect normally to give the best out of all my work, but sometimes it's not working, and due to some other. Am I audible?
Yes. Now you got.
Yeah. Okay. I expect most of the time to give my best, all the works which I have doing in my office, but sometimes which is not actually done. Ramesh, would you like to, if you can? Yeah. Thank you.
And how do you feel about the fact that those expectations are not met?
I get disappointed sometimes,
Yeah.
and sometimes I will work not did earlier, but sometimes I try to adapt some other skills and work some other strategy to maintain or practice with my colleagues. So, but mostly I'll get disappointed when I did give my best.
It can be hard, I think, to deal with that. So,
So, what kind of expectation this could be? Is it rigid or?
it does seem like it's a bit rigid in terms of the fact that you're feeling disappointed, that you're not able to do it. So there is some feeling that you should have met that expectation every single time. So I think it's important, I suppose, to really understand in terms of identifying this, what kind of expectation is it, is how you feel when those expectation is not met, right? Do you feel disappointed every time? Do you feel disappointed sometimes? Or do you feel that sometimes you're able to feel disappointed and then manage, which is what it sounds like right now, is that you seem to be able to have the feeling of disappointment and yet sort of move through that by saying, okay, maybe there's any alternative that we can do.
Yeah.
So it seems like, you know, you're able to sort of manage it in that sense, but it might be useful to then really look at, if you have this expectation of yourself and if it's not happening, you know, then where is this expectation coming from? Did anyone set this expectation for you? Is this an expectation that makes sense? And you know, when did this expectation start in terms of your work? That might be useful for you to think about.
Yeah, normally people give good feedback. You have done best, you have done well. But still, it is something questioning me. Am I perfect in that way? Did I do well? I would have done much better than this. So, this kind of questions which I normally have in myself, nobody said to me, but I'm not satisfied most of the time. I'm thinking I could have done better. When I just recall my work, what I have done, oh, I have not done better. I would have done in this way, like
Right.
that.
Right. Yeah, so definitely feels like despite people telling you that you did a good job, you still feel like I should have done something.
Yes.
That means that there are some expectations that you seem to have of yourself that are different from other people's expectations of you.
Yeah.
So that becomes important to look at. What are these expectations that you have of yourself? Where did these expectations come from? But thank you for sharing. It can be really hard to share these expectations. So thanks for doing that. Anyone else that would like to share?
Pradhana, we expect all, our team to submit reports timely.
Okay.
In the definite time. But when we don't get those reports submitted on time, that will affect submission at our, that will cause delay, submission at our end. So that will give some emotional disturbance also. No? So I think this is exactly rigid experience, right?
Yeah. And a lot of workplaces end up working on having rigid expectations of each other, saying that you have to have deadlines, you have to submit reports, because work is functioning that way in that sense.
Yeah.
And if it's not met, then because as a workplace, it's a system of expectations. It is not that you are setting this expectation of somebody else. It is that your workplace is setting that expectation for you, so that individually we don't have to do it with each other. Right? So it's a rigid expectation from a system, which is true for, say, legally also, right? Like laws are essentially rigid expectations that the government has of us or society has of us, to say you're not going to commit crime, you're not going to, or you're going to obey traffic rules. These are rigid expectations, but these are rigid expectations the system have of us, not individual people. So that is important to also understand.
Yes, yes. Here, the base for my expectation is that expectations from my superiors. They expect me to submit report in that given time.
Exactly.
So I expect my co-team or team members to respond and submit timely.
Yeah. So to a certain extent, then that because you're getting the expectation from someone else, it isn't translating to how you interact with your team members. And then we will talk about managing, in talking about managing expectations, we will then talk about how do you deal with these expectations from yourself or from your team members. But yeah, submitting reports is a big expectation, I think, that people have, for sure.
Correct.
That you have to submit it on time, they have to be of a particular quality. These are expectations that people have.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Is anyone else? Like, are there any expectations that we have from the children? Are there any expectations that we have that may not have been fulfilled in terms of the system when we're helping them? That sometimes people are unresponsive, partner organizations, these things can also be there. And to a certain extent, I feel some feelings of disappointment when we're having expectations are valid. But it's important to understand that it's normal for us to have expectations from situations. It's normal for us to have our hopes and our expectations from particular situations. But it can be useful to know that even though it is normal, it can be identified and dealt with differently. You can't stop yourself from having these expectations, but you can at least manage them in terms of saying, okay, once I have this expectation, what can I do? So I kind of just wanted to understand what these expectations are in terms of that. And yeah, if anyone else would like to share, or we can move. All right. Then I think I'm gonna move to the impact of rigid expectations. Nandita, you can stay on the previous slide. Thanks. All right. So now we are going to talk about why do we feel like rigid expectations are the only ones that need to be managed, right? Why do we feel like we need to change having rigid expectations in any situation, even though they're normal? Is because sometimes if we have rigid expectations from ourselves all the time, then that can lead to a deflated sense of self. What this means is that if you constantly feel like you have rigid expectations of yourself, that kind of means that when those expectations are not met, you constantly feel disappointed, you constantly feel upset. And if that happens over repeatedly, that can affect your confidence and self-esteem. Because in a particular situation, when you have certain expectations of yourself, say if you feel like you need to perform well at work and you need to perform well at work all the time, a rigid expectation can mean that if you're not able to perform, you're not really thinking about why that didn't happen, or you're not really wondering whether that expectation, if there is a reason behind that expectation not being met. You're not really okay with the fact that that expectation was not met. You're not dealing with that sense of disappointment, which means that then that can lead to feelings of blaming yourself or thinking that you didn't do something properly, or scolding or being strict with yourself in terms of saying that this expectation was not met and it should have been met and it should have been done this way and no other way. If we're very rigid about that, that can mean that we cannot like ourselves very much. It can affect our confidence. We cannot believe in our ability to be able to do something if we keep disappointing ourselves this much. And that's really important to look at, because it's important in any field, in any work, in anything that we do, to have confidence and self-esteem, and to trust ourselves that we're able to do something. Because if we keep feeling like we're not meeting our expectations and not thinking about why we're not meeting those expectations, that can lead to a deflated sense of self. We don't like ourselves anymore and we don't understand why. So it's important that it can be very difficult impact of having rigid expectations constantly of ourselves in different spheres. So that happens. Another thing that can happen is that sometimes if we keep having conflict with other people in order to meet our expectations, if we keep fighting with everybody to say, no, no, it should happen only this way, it cannot happen any other way, it needs to be perfect, it needs to be only this way and no other way, I'm not okay with it, if these expectations are not fulfilled, then that means that that upset, that disappointment, if it turns to anger towards other people, that means that it can lead to a lot of conflict and a lot of difficult relationships with people around us. So if this is basically related to the kind of expectations that we have towards others, if we have rigid expectations towards other people, that can increase conflict and that can release tension or stress that we have with other people in our lives. So that can be another impact of having rigid expectations constantly. Again, that over and over again having like rigid expectations from people around us can mean that the conflict continues to exist because you keep having expectations of them, you will keep expecting it, it will keep not happening, and you will keep fighting, and that turns into a cycle of conflict that is not stopping. Another thing that can happen if we have rigid expectations is that we constantly live with the pressure to live up to these expectations. We constantly feel pressure to say it should happen this way, it cannot happen any other way. So say if you're a student and we have rigid expectations about how many marks we should get, you have rigid expectations about I should get my first rank every single time, I should get 100 marks in everything. That kind of expectation from ourselves is okay, but if it's a rigid expectation, then that means that you as a student will constantly live with that pressure to meet that expectation, to say I only have to get 100, below anything below 100 is not acceptable. That is a rigid expectation, and that means that you will feel constant pressure, constant stress, constant tension or anxiety. Like it can lead to a lot of like health related concerns, your mental health can be affected if you live with that pressure on a constant basis. So that's a significant impact of having rigid expectations, is that you have to live under that constant pressure, and then that can affect other aspects of your life. Another thing that can happen when we have a lot of rigid expectations is that when those expectations are not met and we're having feelings of disappointment, that feeling of disappointment, if it's there all the time, that can make it really difficult. That can affect our mood, that can affect how we think about ourselves, that can make us feel depressed, that can make us feel like there's no point in doing anything. If I'm constantly feeling disappointed, if these expectations are not happening, then why should I do it at all? Like, let me just not do it. And we can feel like giving up to a certain extent. And it's really important when we're having bad days, when we're going through difficult times, or when, and if we find out that it's because we're having like very rigid expectations of ourselves, to kind of look at, if I expect myself to do this much, can I do part of it? That can be really useful if we find that we're going through a difficult time. So say for example, if you have a rigid expectation from yourself to get up at 6 in the morning every day, and you're not able to get up at 6 in the morning every day, and every morning you wake up saying I should have woken up at 6 in the morning every day, today also I didn't wake up, you feel that sense of disappointment of not being able to get up. It's important to then negotiate with yourself to say, okay, I maybe I won't be able to get up every day, can I try 3 times a week, can I try 2 times, can I try once tomorrow, and then take it from there. So that's kind of trying to deal with those expectations from yourself, to say, okay, if I'm not able to wake up at 6 in the morning every single day, can I try a little, can I try one step forward from there, rather than saying that if you don't wake up every day, it's a complete failure and you shouldn't try at all. So to a certain extent, that can be a useful step in trying to deal with our rigid expectations, to say, okay, if I am disappointed with myself to not be able to meet my expectations, can I take a step back and change my expectation from this particular situation? Can I change it a little bit? Can I break it down into smaller bits? So to a certain extent, with the example that you brought up about deadlines not with submitting reports, and you have a particular deadline for submitting reports, say the first week of the month, and what you find is that despite having this deadline, despite talking to your teammates about the fact that this is an expectation, you're not getting reports. After 2-3 months, it's important to then take a look at why are we having this expectation and what is the reason that it is not being met. Can we change something about the expectation that we're having? Can we help each other in meeting this expectation somehow? Those are negotiations that you can have. But if you have very rigid expectations from yourself, then you will constantly feel only disappointment. You will not work with it. And you will only feel that disappointment all the time. And living with the feeling of disappointment is not easy. So that is another impact of rigid expectation. And it's important in one of the steps of managing expectations, rigid expectations, is to then take a step back and re-look at what is that expectation, where is that expectation coming from, and is there any other alternative to changing that expectation that we can manage. So I think now that we've spent some time in talking about expectations and talking about why rigid expectations are difficult, we will then look at one strategy in terms of how we can manage these expectations. But before that, if there are any questions, I would love to answer them about rigid expectations, about its impact, about anything that we've talked about till now. Is everything clear?
Pratna, I wanted to share something if that's okay.
Sure, please.
Yeah, so I've been working with a particular client, and this third point of under impact of rigid expectations, pressure to live up to set expectations. So when the client was growing up, their parents would only be invested in their academics. Nothing other than academics mattered to the parents in terms of the child's development. So if the my client scored a 93, the focus would not be that she scored a 93. The focus would be on the remaining 7 marks. So there was this constant set of rigid expectations from the parents for the client to either score a 99 or a 100. So now that the client has started a job, I feel like the nature of the expectations might have changed. Like her parents are no longer there to put it on her, but she's internalized them to such an extent that no matter how brilliant of a job she does, she's never able to accept it, because she feels like this is not good enough. I am still not a 100. So I feel when we constantly put ourselves under rigid expectations, the nature of the expectation might change, but I just feel like the chase never stops. You're never able to sit at the destination and say to yourself that I can enjoy this. It's just like a constant tussle as to I don't know what even it leads to in the first place. So that was just a chain of thought that started with the third point here.
Absolutely, and thank you for sharing that, because I think that it's a way in which rigid expectations can have an impact even beyond yourself, right?
Yeah.
What's
And
important?
at one point of time, it might have helped my client gain the validation of her parents. But now it's just like to question and ask yourself, what purpose are these internalized expectations serving you? How are they benefiting you now? So
Yeah.
I think it's constantly important to keep questioning. Okay, one point they were important because they got you the appreciation of your parents, or they got you the appreciations of your superior. But how is it helping you now? Like with this awareness after this presentation?
Absolutely. I think that's a very important question that we've tried to sort of inculcate in this talk about, is that when you're trying to identify your expectations, is that when you're trying to understand how to manage these expectations, an important question becomes, where did this expectation come from? If you have certain expectations from yourself at work, in terms of your family, at school, it's important to take a look back at where these expectations might have come from. And like Nandita's example mentioned, sometimes these expectations can come from other people as well. We may have been taught certain things about our behavior. We may have been taught certain things about what we're supposed to be doing, what is an idea of a good employee, a good person, what is an ideal workspace. These are things that sometimes we are taught through different channels. We are taught by our parents, by our family, by our society, newer society. Sometimes we also get our expectations from media, from movies, from stories, from books. We tend to have certain expectations, and these expectations can be formed from external sources as well. And this is just how we make sense of the world. It's a normal process to learn how the world works, to learn what kind of expectations can happen. Like I think Apurva mentioned in the beginning, it gives us a sense of control. It gives us a sense of understanding when we're setting expectations for in a particular situation. We can, it's a normal process for it to happen. But when we're trying to understand how to manage these expectations, it can be important to understand where these expectations are coming from. Who set these expectations for you? Did you set it for yourself? Did someone else set these expectations for you? Who is this person that set this expectation for you? And are you okay with the fact that this expectation is set in your life, right? So to a certain extent, understanding the source of that expectation can be really, really useful, because then you get a sense of really taking a look or making a decision about saying that, okay, if this is an expectation that I seem to have gotten from my parents, or this is an expectation I got from my teacher in school, should I really continue to try and fulfill this expectation from others? Is that something I want to do? That's an important step in managing our expectation, is to make a decision, is to make a choice, is to say that now that I know that this expectation exists, now that I know that this is a rigid expectation, do I want to continue this way? Do I want to continue working this way? Or do I want to continue behaving this way? Is something that we can make a more conscious choice of. That I think is the intention behind understanding, talking, doing this webinar. All of this is about that particular aspect of trying to understand uh, more, or give more agency towards our own behavior, our own expectations. I hope that makes sense.
Pratna, can I add just one thing here?
Sure.
I think a very important part of this process, when you start questioning your expectations and how they've impacted you, I feel there might be a lot of uncomfortable emotions like regret as to why you didn't stand up for a better expectation, or hurt as to how the expectation impacted you. And I think it's important to be very compassionate towards yourself, that that's the best you knew at the time. That's the best you understood of the world at that time, and just to be a little compassionate in that sense, that now that I know better, now that I'm more aware, how can I use this information to further better my state? Because if I keep beating myself up over this, then there's no difference in the state that I was in then, when I was unaware what expectations were, and what I know now. So I think compassion and forgiveness towards self are a very important part of this process,
Absolutely.
like you already pointed out.
Yeah, and it can be an important process to really talk about the fact that it's not easy to do this. It's not.
Absolutely.
It's not like once you identify these expectations, immediately you will be able to change it, or immediately you will be able to manage it. Suddenly, like that, like on switch, those expectations will go away. These are things that we're taught for a long time, where we're sort of like we change ourselves in such fundamental ways on an everyday basis for so long, that changing these expectations, understanding them, can also take time. It's not necessarily very easy to do, to a certain extent, in terms of how we are explaining it to you. We're just sort of giving you the tools to be able to do it, but doing it in itself can be quite a difficult process. All right, then I think let's move ahead to the next aspect of it, in terms of one of the ways in which we can manage these expectations. So this is a method that was taught by the same sort of school of thought, where we've taken this entire model from. It's one of the schools of therapy called REBT, which basically focuses on this idea that dealing with expectations, managing expectations, can help in managing our own mental health. And one of the ways in which they thought it would be useful to be able to manage our expectations is to understand it in this particular flowchart type diagram. So this is a very useful method, like that was actually meant to be done with a therapist, with a particular person, but it also can be something that you can do on your own. So we thought that we would be able to spend some time in explaining it to you, so that whenever you feel like you need to be able to manage your expectations, or there is an expectation that you have identified as rigid or difficult for you, and you want to be able to change that, Because it's not just rigid expectations that you might want to change. You might also want to change your weak expectations, or might have more expectations from a particular situation or from other people around you. And in order to do that, considering how difficult it is, considering the fact that it's not just something that happens on its own, it's important to understand then what are the tools in which we can use to do that. So this is one of the tools that we wanted to discuss with you today specifically, so that you'll be able to do it. So this is something that you can do writing down, you can do it while talking to somebody, you can keep it and you can think about it in this particular way. Writing is usually the most useful way in which you can do it if you're comfortable doing that. So this is the basic model. First aspect of it is, it's called the ABCDEF model, EF method. The A is, in this particular situation, is the activating event. So what is the situation that has made you feel like you have a rigid expectation? What is the situation that has made you feel like there is an expectation that you have and you're not able to change that expectation from yourself? What is that event? Is it waking up? Is it conflict with someone? Is it feeling disappointed about something? Is it feeling anger? So where did that anger come from? Is to understand what is that event that brought you to the realization or brought you to have certain expectations. Is it at work? Is it at home? Is it with someone? So what is that event is something that you have to start off by. If you feel like it's difficult for you to really understand a particular event, or if it's difficult because it feels like it's happened across so many situations that you don't know one situation where it got activated, it's also okay to sort of take an example event to say, okay, these are many situations and when I felt disappointed, these are many situations where I have rigid expectations. It's okay to just take one of them, any one of them that you feel comfortable thinking about. Take that as your activating event. It's all right to choose one. The second thing is the beliefs. So once you have chosen a particular activating event that has made you feel like you have some expectations that you want to change, then it's important to look at what are your expectations from that particular situation. What are your expectations from yourself? What are your expectations from the people in that situation? What are your expectations from the situation or the world itself? So that is something that you need to then write down or really look at in terms of about that particular event. What are your beliefs or expectations? The third aspect of it that can be really useful to then look at is the fact that now that there is this event and that you have these expectations, what happens because you have those expectations? And these are consequences. So consequences can be feelings that because you have this belief and because you had this activating event, you felt this particular way. Someone mentioned that, there's even though there is a particular task that is done, and there are people that are giving you good feedback, your internal expectation is that you should have done better. Your internal expectation is that you could have done more. So because of that internal expectation that you have of yourself, what is the consequence? What do you feel in that particular situation? How does that particular expectation from yourself change your behavior or affect your behavior? Do you go back to trying and working harder? Do you go back and feel disappointed with yourself? Do you go back feeling more tired because you're disappointed with yourself? Are you angry or upset or sad because you're feeling that disappointed about yourself? Or do you put your more energy into work because you felt like you should have done more? Do you push yourself because of that? So those are all consequences that we may have emotionally or behaviorally that come from this particular expectation in this particular event. So that can be also important to look at, is the fact that once this event happened and I felt this way, then I did this, or then I felt this. So that can be the consequences that you can think about. Once you have understood what these consequences are, it can be important, if you want to manage or if you want to change your expectation, is to really look at that expectation and question it. Is to understand, like we talked about, where did this expectation come from? What is this expectation? Is it rigid? Is it weak? Why am I not being able to be flexible about it? Who gave me this expectation? Is to also dispute your belief, in the sense that you can debate with yourself, or you can really sit and think about, what if this expectation wasn't there? How would I change my behavior? Would that be okay with me? What if this expectation is something that we can change? Can we change this expectation a little bit? Can we change this expectation entirely? how would that change your behavior? So these are internal thought processes that you can have with yourself in terms of disputing your beliefs or disputing your expectations. That's part of the process that you can have once you've charted out this much. Once you've done that, it's once you've debated or disputed with your expectation to find out more alternatives of different expectations that you can have from this situation, then you can look at what new beliefs can come across. So if not this expectation, what other expectations are possible? What is there a more palatable, a more manageable aspect of this expectation that can exist from you or from yourself that might make it easier for everyone around you as well as yourself? So it's important to then understand how do you want to adapt that particular belief, and what that would mean. The F in this particular method would then be, what are the new feelings or what are the new consequences that you're having to changing your beliefs? So it's kind of like an experiment, right? You're changing your beliefs, and then you have to understand, okay, so I changed my beliefs, and then I went back to work. What did that change? Did I feel better? Did I feel less disappointed? Was I able to put more energy into work because I felt less disappointed? Did I have more confidence because I was able to do it? Did I have less conflict with people around me because I've changed my expectations? So the F is to understand, okay, now that I've changed my expectations, what is the result of that? What has happened because of that? And these new feelings or new situation can be a change in your behavior with other people, or a change in how you feel internally as well. So it can be internal change, it can be external change. Either of that is fine. So this is one method that you can use to be able to manage your expectations, identify your expectations, and also be able to change them. I hope that made sense. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, what if somebody having expectation on me? Then how can I work with that? Example has somebody have discussed about the parents' expectation on children, and
Yeah.
how a person can deal with others' expectation. What are the activity that I could do?
Correct. Very important question. Thank you for asking that. I think that to a certain extent, other people always have expectations of you, and that can be really difficult to deal with. And it's important for us to then look at, do we accept this expectation? Do you want to continue having this expectation of yourself? Is to differentiate between what expectations other people are having from you and what expectations you're having from yourself. That can be difficult for us because automatically we internalize it. Means that if other people are expecting something of us, we feel like, oh, if they're expecting it, means we should also expect that of ourselves. So to a certain extent, it can be useful to separate those two things and to make a choice as to whether you want to accept that expectation. And to, if you're not going to accept that expectation, to communicate with them to say, I know you expect this of me, but I'm not going to do it. That can be about drawing boundaries between you and the other person. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, but some way we are so voiceless, right? We can't say no. And if somebody says you have to, I mean, if they are expecting something on children, especially to get score more marks, then
Yeah.
children are not in a position to say no. They
Right.
cannot bound any boundaries. They cannot draw any boundaries between parents and children, because we are working with children. So how we can tell children to manage with this expectation?
To a certain extent, it's difficult to really do it with other people as much as we can do it ourselves. So you can tell them to really think about, we may not have control over particular situations. It's important to understand that our behavior might not change that much in particular situations where you might not have control over what other people expect of you. But our feelings can be something that we can deal with, in terms of the fact that if someone is upset or disappointed with us, does that mean that it is our fault? I hope that makes sense. Like if children are facing pressure from their parents to study or get a lot of marks, that is the parents forcing them in that particular situation to meet their expectations. And that happens a lot. And to a certain extent, it can be really difficult to see because those expectations, the parents need to change those expectations. The children are in a helpless situation because they don't have that much control. But it's important for the children not to internalize it, which to say that they can have different expectations of themselves, and they can maybe not feel that disappointment, and to know that it's not their fault uh, that they're not able to meet those expectations. I hope that is making sense.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Can I add one more point, Radna? I think with children, when we are talking about children, it becomes essential that any kind of work we may want to do, we involve parents or teachers. Definitely, because it's just one of those things where we need to sort of collaborate and work for the child. But also, like Pratna said, we have to understand that we may not have complete control over certain things. Like, you can't really control what the parent can sort of expect or tell or not tell the child. But if it is possible to just sit and have a chat with the parent as to what impact can this have, and if that's not possible, just if it is in your control to provide constant reinforcements for the child by just praising for whatever efforts they're putting and letting them know that this is enough. I think for a child, even if at home situation may not be so great, if they have at least one person who looks up to them, who sort of cares for them and shows affection, if they have at least one person, it makes a world of difference for a child. So to see what control we have and to just do whatever we can in our control can be helpful.
That even though we either try and talk to the parents about these expectations that they have of their children, or can we at least help the children in whatever capacity we can? Absolutely. Does anyone else have any other questions? This is the end of our presentation. We also seem to have reached time.
Do anyone have any questions? Please ask now, or we'll move to the next one. Okay, so it seems like people are clear about it. So now I request Jennifer to give a concluding remarks and note of thanks for the session.
Thank you,
Jennifer?
Surya. Yeah, Surya. Yeah. So today I think we had a great and beautiful session. So especially when I want to conclude, so I just want to conclude like I have expectations, but as a grown up and learn to certain extent, and with my wide experience to certain extent, I can decide on my expectation. But here is something I learned new with practical examples from the present situations. So Ms. Apurva was so clear and like fluent in her presentation, and she made it very clear. And I like the way which she gave an example of what is expectation is with the roller coaster and joint wheel. So that I really liked it. And also Apurva made us to understand why are we talking about expectation. The common man requires to be made understand about the same. So it is our belief that guide us and help us make decision and make us expect. So, following which, it was also a good for us to know how to distinguish between our expectations. So, because many of us need to learn our expectations, and Ms. Pratana spent our valuable time in dealing with the same, and also she made us to understand what is the distinguish like flexible, weak, and rigid type of expectation, where very clear and it was explained with very practical examples in our daily working time and also in the personal life. And also the important thing was like why do we need to manage the rigid expectation and also the ABCDEF method. So which was really enlightening, Pratana. So also so I think all of us have learned and might have come with a great expectation, and we'll be using it practically in our work and also in our personal life when we are dealing with children or dealing with the co-workers and dealing with the personal family relatives. So yeah, here I thank especially every the Alternative Story team for giving us your thoughts and your valuable time for us in explaining the concept. So thank you, the whole team of Alternative Story, Apurva and Pratana, especially for giving us the enlightenment about the rigid expectation, like how to adopt and things like that. And also, I especially thank our CIF team throughout the country, or north, south, east, and west team is attending. I think I thank everyone for your valuable participation, and also Andrew, Nirish, and Surya. Andrew for setting up the background, and also Nirish and Surya working behind the screen, so making this session successful. So thank you, Nirish and Surya. Also, not but not the least, so our partner organization. So many of the directors, coordinators, and team members have participated for this session. I thank each and everyone for their valuable time and attending this session and making it successful. Thank you, everyone, for your great time. Thank you. Thank you, Pratana and Apurva.
Thank you so much. It was our pleasure. It was really, we really hope that it was useful for you. Really happy to hear.
Yes, thank you.
So thank you, and I thank our CKH team, and of course Arlene ma'am, who were constantly supporting us. And I would like to thank the executive director for their complete support from the behind for all the programs that we do. So thanks once again. So see you in next session.